Good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the third day of our Cross-Border Cooperation Congress. Let me remind you that all Congress panels and all workshops are translated or interpreted into Russian, Polish and English. Today, I give the floor to Ms. Justyna Król, consultant of the City Experiment Fund UNDP Poland, and we are going to talk about economic aspects of the pandemic situation and how it influences the economy and how this economy is likely to change. Ms. Justyna Król, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be the host and the moderator of today's panel. We have a really great group of experts, quote unquote, in the room. So it's going to be a lot of interesting discussions and I'm sure vigorous disputes about the imperative of growth and the different aspects of COVID, the pandemic, and its impact on our economic and social life. But before we jump into it, I want to give the floor to Mr. Charles Landry, who is going to give us an opening lecture. Good morning, Charles. The floor is yours.
Yeah, I'm so pleased to be speaking to Lublin and the wider world. I had a lovely time in Lublin a couple of years back. And I wish I was with you, but I can't be. So can I just share my screen and just do a few impulses for our conversation, if that's okay? So I'll do that. And here is my screen. Let me put it to the top. And I will start. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
You can see it. That's fabulous. Anyway, I think the hubris that we perhaps had in the world has been humbled and been shaken up. And I think crisis, as we well know, is a time, or this crisis is a time for deep rethinking. And I think what everything reminds us of, that we recognize that the civilization we have is a thin film of order we build around the chaos of events, and that chaos of events has to some extent exploded. Now, already before the pandemic, people have been thinking in terms of cities and regions and countries. Where are we going? How do we live more harmoniously with nature and things like that in our cities, etc.? And an artist friend of mine locally, he changed lockdown to lockdown, and I just thought that was a very good piece of public art that reminded us of the situation we are in. Now, this question of the future is obviously now relevant in a way that it has never been before. And I think what we've recognized is the fragility of our systems. So words like resilience have suddenly become much more relevant. Our lack of preparedness is just one indication of that fragility. And so the question is, can we put the pieces together again in a way that deals with the issues and urgencies that were there before the pandemic? And the question is, what is that economic system and what are the priorities that we then shape? Now, one of the big issues around the pandemic, and it was beginning to happen before, is our sense of place, space, and time is changing as our spatial geography shifts. Now, this is a great opportunity, in fact, for smaller places, because it clearly means, as you can see all over Europe, people are moving out of some of the big central hubs into smaller places where they feel there's better, I don't know, closer to nature, more space, and issues like that. Now, when you think of home working, if you have to be in the office every day, you have to be very near the central hub. If you only have to go into the office 2 times a week or one time or three times, you can live further and further away. Now, that has implications, obviously, on the development of the overall regional economy and the generation of hubs within that wider spatial setting. But it also shifts a whole series of things. And one of those is to do with mobility. And this might mean that we have to reinvest more strongly in connective infrastructures between different towns and cities in a wider region. And the issue there, again, is about the last mile. And micromobility may here be a very important factor, that you go by train up to a certain point and then with micromobility do the last few kilometers. That might mean that the city itself might change the way the road systems look, because there may be fewer cars and so on. And all over the world, we have seen lots of examples of pop-up cycleways. Now, the question is also, what do we do with all the many offices we have in cities? And there may be an opportunity here. If there is less office space needed, it might well mean that we can turn these into mixed-use settings. Then it may well be that young people, and I think young people to some extent will lead the recovery because obviously they're less affected by the virus. But that question of what do you do with all these buildings is incredibly important. And so the new hubs may look something like this, like that amazing Station F in Paris, where you're sort of together, but you're also separate at the same time. Now, one of the big economic issues is also obviously the relationship between the old and the young. And more there is discussion around the world. You know, the 6,000 scientists who signed documents saying we need to protect the old and let the younger cohorts begin to be active, socially active and economically active again, particularly because of the mental health pressures that we can see everywhere. But let's not forget the bigger picture. Before the pandemic, we were in the midst of a systemic crisis. All the global organizations said that the business as usual approach will not work. We know that the economy has been materially expansive, which is why we have these climate issues, socially divisive, inequality is rising, and environmentally hostile. Just remember that Earth Overshoot Day, the day when we used all the global resources for one planet, was the 23rd of September in 2000. Last year, it was the 29th of July. That, I think, is an iconic fact. And then we have this other issue, that the world is turning to its darker face. We're very insecure about each other. We're worried about the people who are different from us and so on. And this darker face of the world can cause, I don't need to mention this, dramatic problems. So in some sense, we were always at 1 minute before midnight. But I think we need to ask ourselves whether that question of the old normal needs to change, which some people feel is an exotic destination. So the older urgencies are still there, but for the first time, we saw a glimpse of the biggest experiment in climate change emissions ever at the beginning of the pandemic. And that showed us what we can do. Now, what we really need to do, of course, is generate the innovations that will actually solve those big problems we know about. So what is that plan B? That plan B, within which the creative economy, for example, has a big role, but many, many other innovative actors, is clearly related to the circular economy, using smart technologies, all of these things. This is an image from the opening of We Make the City Festival in Amsterdam last year. And you can see the words there, the city better for all of us, make the city circular, be seriously smarter, all of these words that we use all the time. And increasingly people are talking about the need to harness and gather our collective intelligences. And that means all the partners in a city or a region and so on, the municipality, the private sector, the civic worlds, and so on. Now, we were living, and we still live, in a nomadic world. We've still been very much on the move. That move, of course, used to be much more physical and so on. And what we've experienced, of course, is the dramatic digital turn. And what that has meant, the speed of that, the fact that we're having this conference now in the way we are, is that we've really already, in 2025, many of these movements were already beginning to happen, but they've been speeded up incredibly quickly. So in some senses, we are in 2025. And that movement now is more to do with, obviously, ways of giving immersive experiences to people who are trying to hold events like now. How can we make this event that we're doing even more emotionally satisfactory, even more so we feel we are close together? Because one of the big issues that is still true always, human beings want zones of encounter. Those zones of encounter will be different. We also want zones of places of empathy where we can come together. And this reminds us of the power of proximity. There has always been the human desire to be connected. And this is why the English expression socially distanced is so wrong. What we're talking about is being physically distanced, not socially distanced. And there will be creative innovations about that, particularly in public space, between, for example, the inside, the semi-inside, the nearly outside, and the completely outside. As we reach Christmas and winter, we will begin to see all sorts of ways of being semi-outside where you are still warm. Now, the innovations that we require, of course, is that that does not use too much energy in order to meet the wicked problem of climate change and so on. But all of this thing about proximity is really about shaping our identity and issues like that. So what we see in this image here of this line in the middle is just the cover of my book, which is called The Civic City, where I describe the fractures and fault lines and the fragilities that I'm just talking about now. But the big issue, really, because there were three crises, or there are. There's the health crisis. We may overcome it if there's a vaccine. We may or may not get a vaccine. SARS has no vaccine, just to remind us all. Secondly, there's the economic crisis that is going to explode the moment the subsidy systems stop. But thirdly, there is a psychological crisis. Everybody who has witnessed what we have seen here in 2020 so far will never forget it. From the small child who is aware to the older person and the middle-aged person. And so what we have here is a combination of angst and anxiety and a great difficulty in seeing that silver lining, that future, that vision, that ideal. And this is a real dilemma. So this psychological question is partly also to do with economic development, of course. If you have no confidence, you might not take a risk. So all of these factors come into play. Then, since creative development of the various sorts is based also on having confidence. Now, there are 5 constants for me in the work I've done, it may be different from you, that seem to be really important for people living in places like cities or regions, which is the need for anchorage, the need for possibility, the need for connection, aspiration to some extent, ambition, and having inspiration. So, obviously places still need that heritage, that memory, but back to the point that we need to meet, talk, and connect in some way. And this is where many innovations will occur, and particularly developing probably from within the creative industries. So these places of, coming together, this happens to be Helsinki, it's a mindfulness place where developed by social services and the church, where when you go in, you really come together with the other people who are there. Now, I did an exhibition recently of my work, and I'm sorry to be so self-centered, but I did this recently in Italy, and I highlighted from all the thousands of conversations I've had over the years, what is really significant. And it's back to those 5 constants: a place of originality, distinctiveness, and anchorage. Now, distinctiveness in terms of retail, of course, has suffered because it's precisely those shops that are declining. Now, we all know that there is not often very much distinctiveness. These are all the tourist buses from about 20 countries, and they're all the same company. They all look the same. Or these are signs you see everywhere. I'm sure there's a Polish Coca-Cola there as well. There's certainly a Ukrainian one I can see, and an Australian one. But anyway, my point is, distinctiveness is really one of the great issues, but it's also very difficult now when the big, Amazon, of course, is winning and so on, and the locality is suffering. Now, distinctiveness could be here. I'm showing you 2 Indian pictures, one of Jodhpur and one of Kolkata. I'm not saying you need to do that in Lublin, but at least in these places where you are. The second point is this place of connection and communication. And I've already highlighted that the new infrastructures are really going to be major task for all of us. And there will be all forms of mobility, including on the one extreme walkability, on the other extreme, perhaps flying. So that connection is also physical, of course. I've mentioned that already. But it's also having these places, and this is just an image I created from sitting in one place for 5 hours and just looking at the world go by. I mean, it's only a metaphor just to show you that. The third issue is creating places of opportunity and ambition. And that needs, I think, an ethical framework. And that ethical framework has, in a sense, been highlighted by the problems of the pandemic. So if we are innovating things, let's innovate things that make us healthier, that make things better, and so on. So ambition is not only just building buildings, it's also dealing with, for example, the massive waste problems that we're creating through our consumer society. And in order to sort out waste, this is the biggest waste disposal plant in Finland, in Lahti, this makes a hell of a lot of profit just in passing. So actually working out how you gain and mine waste is, again, requires lots of innovation. Just a reminder, the gold in the cars of Europe at this moment is 40 tons. Now, if you can get that gold back, that gold, I think, is worth 8 billion euros. I don't know. But I'm just saying there's a massive potential here. The fourth element of what I think is important is this notion of a place of nurture and nourishment. And all of these things that I think I thought about for years, I still think they're relevant. I don't know if you do, in the time of the pandemic. Nurture and nourishment basically means care facilities, having good food, having markets and all of that, etc. And finally, there is this need to be inspired. For some, inspiration is a church. For others, inspiration is a museum. For others, inspiration is simply having a nice meal with 3 friends. And that inspiration, and I think you need it also in the physical landscape of the city. Many of you will recognize this image, which is Millennium Park in Chicago, which I showed a moment before. So inspiration and imagination is really key. And this leads me to my final point, which I've just held a week-long event, remote, called the Creative Bureaucracy. It really is a signal. The word is an oxymoron, but what it's saying that public administrators, they are also interesting. They can be creative. They can rethink in the current period how they connect to people and so on in different ways. And what we need in these public administrations, I believe, is also the young to feel that this is just as exciting as working in IT or in the creative industries. And that does mean, if you want to recruit these, that the idea of leadership changes and so on. And one of the big themes that came through in our festival was the idea of humble leadership, reducing hierarchies and enabling people. Our world survey of bureaucrats, which we summarized in the festival, said that the thing that people want most is flexibility, not only in terms of working at home, but other forms of flexibility. So this is a future young bureaucrat, if you like. It's the daughter of Annalisa Boni, the lady who runs Eurocities. And I think that's the end. And that's 19 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks for making it 19 minutes. Very, very concise and yet so rich. I think the nexus that you're attaching with the topic of the crisis that was already unraveling in the world, the trends that we've already been exposed to, but we chose in a way to somehow ignore or push to the side, plus the consequences of the pandemic and the 5 dimensions that you mentioned that we need in order to thrive and to find our places, is the nexus that we would be now discussing throughout this panel. This is very, very interesting also from the perspective of resources. If we think about even cities and their shrinking resources as contrasted with the dimensions, the 5 dimensions that you mentioned, we need to ask a question: what is the principle, what's the imperative behind the decisions regarding these resources? How do we allocate them in these changing times, given the values, the merits, the needs of our community? So this is very interesting, and I think it's a perfect segue to our discussion that will come in a minute. Please take a moment to take a breath, and we will begin our panel discussion immediately after this short video.
Witaj, miło Cię widzieć. Chociaż znamy się nie od dziś, myślę, że jeszcze wiele o mnie nie wiesz. Znajduję się w centrum Europy, więc szybko do mnie dotrzesz. To dzięki ostatnim zmianom w infrastrukturze drogowej, kolejowej i rozwojowi lotniczej siatki połączeń. Za granicą jest o mnie coraz głośniej. Ostatnio mówią o mnie, że jestem smart. Wdrożone rozwiązania potwierdza certyfikat ISO i liczne międzynarodowe rankingi. Jestem pewien, że znajdziemy wspólną przestrzeń, taką, w której będziesz mógł się rozwijać. Będąc kompaktowym miastem, gwarantuje Ci atuty metropolii, jednocześnie zapewniając komfortowe warunki odpoczynku z dala od zgiełku zatłoczonego miasta. Wiem też, że wspólnie możemy się wiele nauczyć. Dzięki mnie dowiesz się, gdzie inwestować w wiedzę. Pokażę Ci, jak kwitnie współpraca biznesu, nauki i samorządu. U mnie znajdziesz miejsca, w których innowacje nabierają realnych kształtów. Przedstawię Cię osobom, które mają na to swoje patenty. Zobaczysz, jak nowe technologie sprawdzają się w praktyce. Przekonasz się, że jestem dobrą inwestycją, nie tylko jutro, ale tu i teraz. Nie czekaj. Przyszłość zaczyna się tu, w Lublinie.
Thank you very much. I think that's the perfect statement to start with. So the future begins here in Lublin. Let's start the future with the panel discussion that we're about to have. And just a couple of words of introduction on the topic. As you know, the conversation today is going to be around the imperative of growth. We've been using GDP or GDP per capita as a measurement of our standing, of our country's standing for decades now. There have been attempts to look at our well-being, our development, our standing from different perspectives. There have been indices that were designed by many different teams around the world to try to capture where we are, both economically and socially, to combine the many important aspects of our living. And one of these indicators was the Human Development Index that was co-designed by a Polish team some time ago. So there have been attempts, then there have been many different research papers trying to bring us closer to understanding how we are doing as developing countries, cities, and nations. But the indicator that we keep referring to over the last, 6 months now, is the number of infected people, is the number of people that have died due to coronavirus. I don't think it's a question or it's a point of discussion that the pandemic has changed a lot. So during the discussion today, what we want to dig deeper into is first the general question as mentioned. So is growth, economic growth, still an imperative for us? If so, in what way? And then switch to a more targeted questions about key results, key effects of the pandemic that we're already noticing in our communities, in our cities, and in our economies. And that would be remote work, new business models, and the impact of both creative industries and, as Charles has mentioned, creative bureaucracies. And finally, the topic of collective knowledge. So where is our knowledge now? Where are we as experts physically and then intellectually? And how does that contribute to our communities and in our country? So there's a lot to discuss. There's a lot to go into. But luckily, I have great company for this sort of discussion. Let me introduce to you our speakers, our panelists. You've already had a chance to listen to the introductory lecture by Charles Landry. Together with Charles, we're going to be speaking with Dr. Ewelina Iwanek, who is the president of the board of the Polish Foundation of the Opportunities Industrialization Centers. Good morning.
Good morning.
Great to have you. We're also going to be talking to Rasmus Tscherning, who is the director of the Creative Business Network from Denmark. Good morning, Rasmus.
Good morning.
Good morning. Great to see you. We're also joined by Professor Alexander Sagomonov from the Russian Academy of Sciences. Good morning.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning.
And last, but of course not least, we're joined by Dr. Mariusz Sagan from the Municipality of Lublin and also Warsaw School of Economics. Good morning.
Good morning. Good afternoon.
I'll be moderating the discussion, but of course the floor is also open to you as the audience. You have a chance to post your questions in the chat box. Our supporting moderators will be collecting these questions and handing them over to me. So I'll try to make sure to ask as many of them as possible to our guests. Please note that Charles Landry is going to be leaving us in an hour, so a bit earlier than the wrap-up of our discussion. So if you have any urgent and burning questions, and I'm pretty sure there are some, to Charles, please make sure that you send them in a bit earlier so that we can have them also addressed during our discussion. That would be it for housekeeping, and I think we can get to it. Everyone ready? I can see some heads nodding. Okay, we're good to go. So our discussion will be divided into roughly 3 segments, and the first one will be addressing this broader question of economic growth and if it's still an imperative. Do we need economic growth? And if so, in what way? And Alexander, I would start with you if you don't mind. From a sociologist's perspective, and having observed what's been going on in the world over the last 6 months, what's your take on the need for economic growth? Do you believe that societies need economic growth to remain healthy or cohesive? Is this an incremental part of social well-being, or is it not? What's your take on this topic?
Окей, спасибо. Я буду говорить по-русски, если есть перевод, буду очень рад этому. Я хотел бы с самого начала, во-первых, поблагодарить за приглашение на участие в этой замечательной панели.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. I'd like to stress one thing, or refer to what Charles was talking about, that is our thinking is already in 2025, not in 2020. Let's take it like an umbrella approach for all the problems that we're going to cover today. So we are in 2020 now, but our thoughts travel ahead to post-COVID era. And, well, there are no signs that this is going to be over soon. We don't know where we are on this way, so we never know how long it's going to take. But when we ask the questions about what is the imperative for cities, I think economic growth isn't at this point the main imperative. And why is that? Over some past years, we have seen that economic growth was 1 to 2%. The global economy was actually slowing down on economic growth. And it was no longer only a philosophical concept, it was new reality. So if we don't see any growth, why do we need to really stick to this GDP paradigm? Because it doesn't show us too much about ourselves, about where we are. Besides the economic crisis that we are going through now, businesses, people go beyond the boundaries of market economy. And in Russia, in east part of Russia, small and medium businesses suffered in the first place, and they are now recuperating slowly. And they can really generate a quick growth. But a more important thing is for cities to survive as such, because cities should understand what is beneficial and what is profitable at this moment. Previously, we thought economic growth is the answer. Now we tend to think more and more that it's not economic growth, but it's to seek possibilities to accept certain processes as normal. And the economic growth, as we see it in Russia, well, there is what we call desurbanization. So people are leaving cities, leaving corporations, or go online, and the government actually supports this approach of people going to set up their own businesses or just become self-employed. And this is less probable that people will be forced to leave offices. They just do it. Moscow, over the last 3 months, has lost 2 million people, 2 million residents. And these people haven't returned yet. And I don't even think they are going to return. If this situation continues, then probably they will not return. And who are those who left? So those who are quite secure financially, those who invested in the city's economy, and also people who really made the city go, and they sustained those big businesses. And the question is now, who is going to provide maintenance services, who is going to clean the city, who is going to do the very basic work. And people who live away from Moscow, 200 to 250 kilometers, they're not going to commute on the daily basis. So micro-mobility that Charles was talking about is actually impossible. It's out of place in Moscow at this moment. Perhaps we can return to this later. And over the last 6 months, so much has happened across Russia and the world that if this situation continues, as some experts say, some say it is going to take 2.5 years, then the changes will go even deeper. And economic problems of cities will only grow. The question is whether small cities will survive this, or small places, as Charles put it. That's another question, open question to you.
Thank you. I think we are going to come back to several points that you made. I think what is very interesting also as a question on the sociological side is you highlighted this notion of people who can afford to leaving the city, but those who cannot afford to leave staying, right? So there's the disparity between our approach to our individual quote unquote economic growth, right? And the communities, cities, or national growth. And clearly the individual takes priority. But I think there can be very interesting consequences of that to our cities, but also, as you mentioned, to the dynamics between big and small cities, villages. That's also.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Я только одну фразу, можно добавлю? One phrase. Вы сейчас очень точно подметили, что пандемические условия создают новый тип неравенства.
That was a good point. This pandemic creates a new reality and inequality between people who can afford leaving the city or who can afford to stay in the city, and those who are totally dependent on how municipal economy is organized. And there is a major inequality between these groups, and these gaps are only going to grow. This will be another problem for our urban management.
Yeah.
Thank you. And it beautifully ties into the question of creating opportunities and inspiration that Charles has mentioned in the beginning.
Yeah.
But let's take another perspective. Ewelina, if I could now ask about your experience and your perspective. You're working with companies and with students who are looking into using, for example, EU funding to grow their businesses. And of course, with each and every funding that is available, there is the growth that is integral to the project. That is almost a given in the philosophy of projects. When you discuss sustainability, longevity of businesses, when you work with businesses in Lublin and beyond, have you seen any changes in the approach over the last few months? What has your experience been in the discussions about this more, say, individual or fragmented growth that we have seen?
Yeah. Thank you, Justyna, for this question. Regarding the economic development, if it is imperative, now at this situation which we are not feel as a businesses, as a society, safety, we don't feel stable. So honestly, I don't think so that we are thinking nowadays about the economic growth. We want to try to see how we are operating in this world, to find some kind of way how to live and how to operate. And the same is going with the businesses. Of course, as every crisis, I suppose that after that we will have some economic growth. It's something I think natural, and we as humans we also have a natural ambition, and we want to go further. We want to be developed. So in one way, someday it will happen. Because now in our IC Panel Foundation, we are running a very nice and very big project, startup platform. We are experiencing new types of innovative business ideas. And the young people, despite of the crisis, despite the pandemic, they are looking for the financial sources. They want to start new businesses, which, of course, they have to find a way how to operate in this situation which we are experiencing. As regards the companies which are operating for years, they don't feel stable nowadays. I mean, especially these ones who are dealing with the transport sector, with the tourist sector. But as all of you were also observed, the tourist sector, it has changed during the last months. And there are more and more ideas, innovative ideas, which are focused on smart technologies, and they are really growing up despite of the situation in which we are now. And just look at the Netflix, such kind of platforms, they just triple their revenues. So there are also the sectors which are taking advantage of the situation, and they are growing up. The others, unfortunately, they have to change their way of working. They have to change their business model to survive and to operate.
Thank you. Yes, and I would love to also dig deeper in the second segment in these new business models. What are you observing and how they shape up? But I would love to now take your points to Rasmus, who can share a more creative industry side of things and experiences. Rasmus, I was doing my homework and I was reading some interviews with you. And in one of them, you mentioned that the Creative Business Center, the network that you lead, part of the role is to sort of build a new story about Denmark that goes beyond quote unquote hygge and candlelight. And the question would be, from the creative industry's perspective, from the perspective of building a new narrative for a country like Denmark, do you feel that growth is losing as an imperative, or to the contrary, that it's the engine behind this new narrative? What has been your experience, but also your philosophy and your approach here?
Well, let me just say that the Creative Business Network, where we're happy to have the city of Lublin in, is a group of organizations from 80 countries that all work with culture and creative industries, and especially with entrepreneurship and innovation in that relation. And I come from a country that a couple of years ago was highlighted as the happiest country, happiest people in the world. So already there, I think we saw a different kind of a measure. Is it best to be the happiest, or is it best to be the wealthiest? And I think the Danes kind of answered that. You've also maybe seen the Carlsberg commercials where they bike around the city and they leave work at 4 and all that. So the good life is measured differently. But I don't think it's that unique for Denmark. I think in most of the Scandinavian countries, we have that attitude. And I think what was interesting to see in relation to the pandemic, and I will get to the creative industries, but first, it was the fact that the growth imperative was overruled completely by the let's take care of each other and make sure we get through this imperative. And that, of course, has caused a lot of stir, and it's been difficult for politicians to decide when they should open up and close down and all that. But it was really, for at least in Denmark, it was clearly, we need to save everyone, also those that are in the nursing homes, even though they might have not have. I mean, a life is valuable no matter what. And then what came out after that is I've seen, first of all, a lot of work. I don't think work has, I can't believe the economy has slowed down in a way, because we're working like crazy, everyone I know, because there's a lot of stuff going on now where we're trying to adjust and recalibrate. And we're also trying to learn from each other. I love the BBC. And on BBC, I read this story about the lockdown heights from South Africa. This was a story about how they made a very popular TV series, or telenovela or instanovela, where the actors are staying at home and acting the scenes, recording it with a mobile phone, and then it's being edited overnight and then published on Facebook Live and Instagram, and really, 1.5 million of followers for one of the actors. So I'm just saying that we see very exciting new forms. I just don't think the exciting new forms will be able to replace that huge amount of money that the citizens of the world left in the cultural institutions, when buying music, when reading books, I think it was 34 billion we have in Denmark our consumption, and no cultural ministry or government can actually cover that amount. So although I see many encouraging new developments in the future of music or the sustainable tourism and all that comes up, and I see also how the startups and the entrepreneurs that I work with really come into the center of innovation with the Safe Travel Challenge by the Paris airports. So I think there's really a new openness to look for solution coming from elsewhere. Because we're waiting for the scientists to maybe come up with something, and we're hoping that will work. But we are also trying to figure out what other new ways that we should live, air circulation, what we touch, and also how we take care of each other. I know that I've spoken to people who have web developers in Brazil, and they're worried whether they get out and get some food, and you wouldn't necessarily worry that much about your suppliers on the other side of the world. And that has really come up, this new connectedness that might stem from the fact that we're all in this together. So the economic growth imperative was already on the fall in many ways. with the circular economy and sustainable development goals, etc., that we need to measure on, but that there are so many other factors that we then measure on. But then when finally now the pandemic came, I think, of course, there were a couple of countries, Brazil, the US, where what's going to happen with business? But for the majority of countries in the world, it has been a matter of really saving our communities, saving the people, and I guess we can also, many businesses can be thankful that we have governments that have been able to support them and to bail them out partially, or at least here in Denmark. I think we will see a movement also towards more government in certain areas, and I think that's not necessarily good when a government suddenly gives itself full authority to do a lot of stuff that you otherwise wouldn't allow them to do. But in general, I think I see there's a movement or an understanding of the importance of governance, which is also very important for the culture and creative industries, by the way, that the framework conditions are right and support systems and the skills and the schools are in place. So this was a little bit capturing it all that I've heard so far from Charles and from Alexander. So, yes.
Yes, thank you. I think, I'm sorry, there's been an echo. I think you started arriving at a very interesting topic, and thank you for also making the segue actually for bringing Mariusz into discussion, because you started talking about governance and the role of governance. And it's also interesting from my perspective how the situation that you're describing, for example, the preference to support, to take care of each other rather than, would differ from culture to culture and from country to country. We see the unrest in the US. We see how many different states within US differently react to the situation. We in Poland see the discussions about lockdown or limiting of how businesses function. Now in Poland, the restrictions, the limits that are introduced are brought to the very local level. So they are not on the national level. They're limited to powiats, which is a sort of sub-regional entity, legal entity. And so the role that the administration would play here is critical. And so I wanted to ask you, Mariusz, I know that Lublin is in the process of preparing of designing your new strategy, your new development strategy for the city. The pandemic has sort of caught you in the middle of the process, and I guess the discussions that we're having right now speak very strongly into the main narrative that a strategy for any city might have, and to the value statement, the mission statement that a city might have. What is your perspective when you look at your work on strategy, but also on strategies that are being developed in other cities? You talk with your counterparts in Poland and beyond. Is it possible from your perspective to have a strategy for a city that rejects, as Rasmus has mentioned, almost rejects the imperative of growth, that puts something else on the pedestal and has growth as maybe a supportive mechanism, but not an imperative as such? What's your experience and what's your take on it?
Justyna, thank you very much for this very difficult question. Let me go back to the 2010, because I was responsible for the creation process of Lublin 2020 strategy. And now, after 10 years, again, I'm involved in the process of the preparation of 2030, Lublin 2030. And if we look at the beginning of this process, 2011, 2020, the Lublin was in a very specific situation. The city was completely cut off from the infrastructure. No motorways, no fast train, no airport. In the city itself, we faced with the real problems with the lack of cooperation between stakeholders, no trust, no serious, ambitious initiatives. I don't want to say that we had nothing, because the culture was at the stage of development at the time. But we really faced the serious problems. And we had two paths of development. One path could be based on the economic growth, measurable things like the number of jobs, like the number of hard infrastructure projects, etc. And the second path we chosen, and that was not the easy decision at the time, that was the path that we focus on the different values. And among these values, I could enumerate the trust, cooperation, focus on the seniors, internationalization, participation, etc., etc. And of course, this strategy was criticized by media, even by the city citizens. They expected sudden growth, the explosion of the jobs in the big corporations coming to Lublin. But the situation was very difficult, as I mentioned before. So we couldn't act as many cities did in 15, 20 years ago. We have to decide in a smarter way. And what we achieved a lot through these 10 years. We were able to build business ecosystems. We encourage companies to cooperate with each other. We also started the process of the knowledge commercialization from the universities to business, and many other processes like that. And we also use this concept of creative bureaucracy, that is the child of Charles, if I can use such expression. And Charles, for the first time, I've heard about the creative bureaucracy in 2017. But our mission and our actions 5 years before were exactly about the creative bureaucracy. So 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 departments of the city run by young, ambitious people changed the mentality of the organization and were starting to implement the different projects in the city for the citizens. And also we were inspiring other parts of the organization to act more internationally, more ambitiously. So that was the beginning. And I think this is the proper sequence. First, to build the natural ecosystem in the city that people cooperate, everybody's cooperating. And then we will have the economic growth. And we can see it, we can observe it in Lublin. Even still, we don't have perfect transportation accessibility. We were able to attract, through these 10 years, more than 15,000 jobs. So not economic growth as an imperative, but the values, cooperation, smart strategy, and then new jobs came. And people are coming back to Lublin from Warsaw and from other cities, also from smaller cities. So for the first time, for the 25 years, we are increasing the population in Lublin. And last comment, the strategy 2030. Again, we will not focus on the growth as an imperative. This is for sure. So this is my answer for your question, Justyna.
Thank you. One thing I'm wondering, and I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but I'm sure you will forgive me. So at some point, a couple of years ago, I moderated a discussion with the then mayor of Nowa Sól, Mr. Tyszkiewicz. And we had this discussion during which he said, up until some point, because Nova Sul, just to explain to everyone listening, has been a city that has been struggling a lot because of collapsing industries and because of its reliance on certain sectors that collapsed. And the new mayor started sort of dragging the city out of the decline and the economic hardships. And when we had that discussion, he said something that sort of stayed with me, and I wanted to ask you, Mariusz, about your take on it. He said, up until some point, you need to prioritize economic development, and only once you achieve certain threshold, you can move to discussing things like co-design, co-governance, collaboration, cooperation, whatever that is. Do you believe that there is a threshold for of this sort, that up until some point the growth should be imperative, or economic growth should be imperative, and only then we move to other aspects, or do you have a different approach?
I wouldn't say that I have a different approach. I think that these processes should go at the same time, parallelly. So you have to build the economic potential all the time. You have to take care of business. You have to build the links in the ecosystem networks. But at the same time, you have to build the trust and different values and co-governance, etc. So this is the case of Lublin, that we were doing all of this at the same time. But I have to say that the development of the cities is very contextual. So the cities in Western Poland and versus cities in Eastern Poland, Moscow versus Kiev, Warsaw versus Berlin, it's very hard to compare the context. Of course, there are some substantial pillars of development, but it varies across Europe, across the countries. And this is my point.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Charles, let me ask you, because you have the benefit of being in constant contact with public administration and from cities all over the world. Last week, as you mentioned, you held a hugely successful event on creative bureaucracies. What is your take on what we've just discussed on the topic of strategizing urban development and the role that bureaucracy plays in it? Where is the place for growth, economic growth, for that? In your last week's discussion, was economic growth a point of focus, or was it not? Could you bring the more overarching perspective now? Oh, you're muted.
Mute myself. Can you hear me? I hope you can.
Yes.
I mean, Mariusz just mentioned something which is very important, which is actually trust, which is a currency. Trust actually reduces transactional costs and things like that. So there are many different ways of looking at what forms of currency we have. That's just one point. But the second point, which already was discussed, is really what is the definition of growth we have? Because growth can also be personal growth. Growth can be various other things. And I think that we all know there are movements like the degrowth movement and donut economics associated with Kate Raworth. And all of those do not imply that there are no activities, no new companies, no new innovations. Because I think that if we have a concept, and Mariusz just talked about values, if a city or a region or a country has a set of values, which they are the principles, and these are strategic principles that a place has within which it acts tactically flexibly, because we don't always can predict things, then that frames the way a city behaves or a region behaves and goes about its business. So if, for example, we agree with the SDGs of the UN, if we agree that it's a good idea to try to live in a one planet world, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of innovations to be had precisely to do that. I mean, I focused a bit on rubbish. I've been looking at rubbish innovations, and they are immense. You know, all sorts of things from science to smart technologies and so on. So just because one reframes things, it doesn't mean this is going to be negative. I think it's going to be potentially positive. Now, much of what's been discussed in the movements around the world is essentially about what is the fourth industrial revolution, whichever name you want to give it. Now, we normally just focus on the digital aspects of that, which are, of course, very important, and there are thousands of innovations to be had. But it's also there, clearly also the green dimension of that, which gives that innovation a direction, which brings me back to where does somewhere like Lublin want to go? What sort of place does it want to be? Now, supposing it says in the 2030 plan, we're going to be the things I've just said, all that means that's an interesting challenge to the businesses, the people in that community, but also not only the businesses, but the community to behave differently. If we're going to behave in a way that is more healthy for the world, then we need to adjust what we do. We might consume less. But consuming less doesn't mean, by definition, there is less business opportunities. Perhaps there's more business opportunities in consuming less. Perhaps the products that are created have higher value. And what this reminds me of, this overall movement, I mean, we all know about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at the bottom of which is sort of survival and living and having something to eat and accommodation and a house, a roof over your head. To some extent, the human race is actually recognizing that there are other qualities below which, one foundation of which is obviously to supply the basic needs. So I think we're in a really beautiful moment to add a different layer onto the economy. But the priority statement might be, as Rasmus says, to be the healthiest place, within which, as a consequence, in trying to be a healthier place, you happen to have economic growth, which is completely different from saying economic growth is a priority and we might become healthy. No, we're saying you're switching the paradigm around. Let's be healthy, and that is probably likely to generate economic growth, in my view.
Thank you. Alexander, I wanted to get your take on what just Charles said, especially on the topic of paradigm shift, because in a moment we're going to move into the consequences, specific consequences of the pandemic. But just to stop for a moment, pause for a moment on this effect that perhaps the pandemic has in terms of generating a paradigm shift. Do you think shocks or crises like this pandemic are enough to generate a paradigm shift, or from a sociological perspective, are there other conditions, other elements that need to appear, maybe on the governance side, maybe on the cultural side, whatever you think is critical in order to shift the paradigm? What's your take on it?
Okay. Спасибо, Justyna. Очень хороший вопрос. И, как сказал Mariusz, вопрос хороший, если он сложный. Я хотел зацепиться за важнейшую фразу, которую говорил Чарльз. Основная задача урбаниста – это how to connect people. Теперь подумайте, в условиях пандемии главная задача, которая стоит перед властями – how to disconnect people.
Can I just pause you, Alexander, for a second?
I will speak English, if you don't mind.
Yes. So
there
yeah,
is no
I was
translation.
just. Yes,
Okay.
I was just going to
I
say
will
that.
speak English. I'm sorry. Maybe I will do some mistakes, but I will speak English
Thank you.
for our usefulness. So Charles was talking about the philosophical principle of modern urbanism in the question how to connect people. And I would say that during the last 6-7 months, the main priority for the local government, for central governments, was how to disconnect people. You see? And this is the discrepancy between the substantial view upon urban development and administrative in terms of pandemia. Okay. When we speak about the creative bureaucracy, I would say that the new motto will be how to reconnect people. And we have a very interesting approach for that. When I will give you 2 examples. First, I don't know whether you were flying used the airport during the last 2 or 3 months. I used 3 times, and I was completely frustrated. I haven't seen any signs of real security in terms of pandemic prevention. You know, I remember the day after the September 11th. It was complete disaster everywhere. You remember 2 or 3 hours queues, securities. Many times you were checked and so on and so forth. Now, nothing serious. Because authorities, they do not think, it's my point of view, they do not think that during the pandemic, every man should take responsibility for himself, first of all. And reconnection of people this year, and I think in the nearest future, will be the main priority for the creative bureaucracies. I would prefer to call them flexible bureaucracies more than creative, because they do not need to create something. They should be flexible for our creation, you know, than to be creative themselves. I'll give you one example. The self-agency. Self-agency everywhere in the world, and especially in our country, is not very much in the developed paradigm, if you are talking about the shift of paradigms. We have, every month, we have hundreds of thousands of people registering in terms of self-agency. You can imagine? So we see the shift of people from the small business, from the middle business. They do not expect the new working places created by someone for them. So they shift to the self-agency, but what they need the new infrastructure, the new urban infrastructure in digital world, first of all, and less bureaucratic restrictions. The very, how to say, the new terms of self-agency. For example, I will say, in Russia, you can be self-agent, but you can't hire anyone for any job, you know? So only you. That's the first restriction. The second restriction, you can't, your income per year should not be more than, I don't remember, 15 or 20,000 euro for a year. So it's another restriction, you know. If you take all the restrictions and give the open floor for people to reconnect with each other during different sorts of business, they will survive and they will create the new innovative platforms. 2 examples. The religious services, we have a lot of opportunities for the new religious services outside the churches. You can imagine, in our conservative country. The second, we have a lot of new educative and sport facilities in digital world, but only in terms of self-agency. So I can give you a lot of other examples showing that this will be, I think it will be the new tendency. But the tendencies of the flexible and healthy city that was last 5 or 10 years, for example, in Moscow, the first crisis was in sharing economy. in all forms of sharing economy, because pandemic conditions, so people do not very much trust in sharing the cars because they don't know who were using them before you and so on and so forth. That's why the former urban innovative forms and innovative models of economic activities, they gone away, slightly gone away. But I think that creative self-agency with the help of flexible bureaucracy, that will be the paradigmatic shift in the cities, in all spheres of economic life. I'm sorry for my mistakes in English.
There were none. There were none. Thank you. Thank you very much. And with this, we're closing the first segment of our discussion, the first section. We looked at the paradigm, the imperative of economic growth through different lens, sociological, business, or administrative. What I would like us to move to now is diving deeper into certain aspects and certain results of the pandemic that we've been noticing that contribute to this overall picture and to this paradigm shift, to sort of better understand where we are in this process, and building on the quote-unquote new business models that you, Alexander, have mentioned, with religious services being delivered outside of churches. I guess in a way that is a new business model for church. Let's see what else do we see out there. Ewelina, I promise that we will go back to you because you already hinted at some new business models that you've been noticing. Could you perhaps give us some first examples, some observations that you have seen in terms of the new business models and how they go beyond survival, as you mentioned it?
Yes, Justyna. Firstly, I would try to concentrate, for instance, on tourist sector. We could observe it in the south countries of Europe. Usually we are used that we are going for the holidays in south of Europe. But because of the pandemic, the countries like Greece, Italy, they changed their approach and they were much more prepared for the internal tourism. This is what I think in all the countries we experience, and in all the countries the tourism sector has changed approach, and the clients are also changing. So we see these changes as regards the clients. Also in the terms of sales and marketing, of course, the online e-commerce, it was, it was for the certain type of companies, certain type of businesses, but nowadays everything and everyone can sell whatever he or she wants through such kind of channels. And as I am observing in our startup platform, there are such big changes, I mean, which are going as regards the selling and marketing towards online tools. And also they are not, of course, concentrated on the domestic market. They are much more focused on the international, trying to find connections and to build and to enter a really big market with our products. But as regards this, also we have noticed during the last 4 months, when we have a new incubation program for new startups, there are a lot of innovative ideas which are focused on the health sector, or they are such ones which are dealing with the working environment. So this is what, Rasmus, you were telling about the healthier environment, also the healthier environment in the companies. So from our perspective as a startup platform, I could point at such very important changes.
Thank you. Rasmus, could you also speak to that? Speaking from the perspective, of course, of creative industries, if you see any good examples that could help us better understand the changes in the business model, but also, if not the entire business models, maybe there are some new trends or discussions that you see within the sector that could benefit also other sectors like tourism or healthcare, as Ewelina has mentioned.
First of all, I think all the time other sectors are benefiting from the skills, the craftsmanship of the creative sector. You should look at the Italian company or interest group called Alta Gamma. They organize cultural and creative companies such as Ferrari, Bugatti, even San Pellegrino is a creative company to them because it's about design and cultural heritage. So I think that's one thing that we should keep in mind. Yes, we have seen fantastic examples from the winner of Hack the Crisis in New Zealand. It was a company that have the older generations tell stories and younger generations draw those stories. So it's a way of trying to keep the connection or make the connections between the different generations that were isolated. The startup is called Draw This and from New Zealand. And we have seen a lot of new ways of working, also related to trash, as you were into Charles Landry, waste and trash management connected with Fab Labs, etc. So I think we've seen a new wave of startups that are completely new or that are that have pivoted because of the pandemic. I also think that some startups are working really hard on the fact that, on one hand, we suddenly discovered that we can run online courses, as I do and my team does, for startups in Americas and Africa, Asia Pacific and Europe, pretty much all at once, and get speakers from all over the world. We can get the best of everyone in business modeling to speak from Bahrain. That is all great, but there's also, maybe it's also not only a Danish expression, but it's called skin thirst. That the skin is thirsting for the feeling of another skin, simply that we can touch. That all this zooming is not replacing the social non-distancing. We need something still. We need some elements that can make us more feel that we're more present, even though we aren't. And I don't know if that's VR or extended reality or whatever. I hope it's not that simple. But I see startups coming up with ways that we can almost get back to the way we were and try to keep safe still. So I'm just impressed. I saw the global Hack the Crisis was won by a company that uses ultraviolet light that is powered by solar cells. That's just not that brilliant. We could have all thought of that, but ultraviolet light it's not as good as disinfecting your hands with a liquid. The liquid can go more into the cracks of the hand, but the ultraviolet light, you can just put it in, put the hands in and take them out again, and then they have been disinfected, and that is all run by solar power, and it's something that you can then roll out everywhere, also where the grid is missing. So I think it's been kind of encouraging. At the end of the day, it's been terrible, and all the losses and all the death and sick people and all the consequences we haven't seen yet. But there has been some areas where we've seen us that has been positive, actually.
Thank you. I would like to ask Mariusz for a comment, but before I do that, I know that, Charles, you have only 5 minutes left with us. I'm being mindful of that. if there are any questions from the audience to you, I would ask the supporting moderators to bring them in. In the meantime, before I give Mariusz the floor, Charles, what would be your main takeaways or suggestions that you would like to share with us after this brief discussion? What could we part with?
Things we say often depend on one's own personality, and this whole creative city idea and creative bureaucracy idea. I'm not going to use the word creative ever again in the future, by the way. That's the last time. But anyway, that approach is really about trying to see the glass half full. And so how I've been reflecting on everything is there a silver lining behind the problem? And I'm always reminded of the Chinese definition of crisis, which is an opportunity and a threat. So obviously we've seen the digital pivot and the digital turn. The main concern for me are two main concerns. One is the human desire for proximity and, in a sense, the desire to touch and feel and all of that. That really concerns me. And I think what there will be, I mean, we're doing this web conference here, there will be innovations around that. The Danish Design Centre, I know Christian Bason is in discussion of a project with your national government, I believe, in Denmark, around how you can create more emotionally rich experiences and so on. So I think there'll be a lot of that. But my other point is really, I'm very worried, obviously, as we all are, about the young. Someone who's just, for example, I don't know, finished their degree. Well, what's the job they can get? I mean, I'll just give you an example. If you're selling art, it's okay to sell a Picasso because we know what the Picasso is like, and it doesn't matter if you physically see it. But what about a young innovator, a young person who can't, through their physical being, help persuade someone either to support them or to buy their products? That's really where I think the very big problem is. I agree with what everybody else has said so far. Alexander talking about loosening the bureaucracy. I mean, Rasmus will know, and we know from Britain that 20 years ago, there were all these bureaucratic obstacles about what sort of company you are. You can't do this, you can't do that. And in a way, that loosening of regulations, and I'm sure they're fine in Lublin, in general, is actually an asset, is a resource that unleashes potential. The final thing I'll say before I have to go, I'm sorry, because I've got another event I'm co-organizing, is I've forgotten my final point because I thought of the other event. No, I suppose my final point is simply city making or making a region is a collective endeavor. Now, I know we use words like inclusion, stakeholders, and all of that. What I think perhaps might be an idea just is also to think of a new vocabulary about how we're going to go about things, because sometimes we say words like sustainability, all of these words, but over time they get drained of meaning. So I'm particularly interested in places, and I'm sure Mariusz is doing that with his colleagues, where you tell a story of where you want to go. Typically, we say our strategy is this and our outcome is this and our action plan is this. But actually, the thing that inspires someone who is the listener, the public, is something that is a story. In our Creative Bureaucracy event, many of the events I felt, or not many, but several, I felt were too abstract. There was an interesting session about resilience, and this person was saying, our resilience strategy is this, and we got this plan and this. And I kept on thinking, give me an example of what actually happened. Okay, you had this resilience plan to do this, and 2 weeks later, 50 people went vegan. I mean, then so that question of storytelling, I think, is really important, because I do think stories are the thing that simplify, but also potentially can create a compelling narrative that gives people the energy perhaps to move forward. I'm not sure any of that was relevant to this, but that was coming into my mind as I was hearing our great colleagues here speak. So I apologize, I have to leave you, and I just hope you have wonderful conclusions, and can you let me know what those are? And hello to Lublin again. So bye-bye. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
we
very
will
much.
make sure to share our final conclusions, but I think the value of discussions like that would be to open the conclusions to further discussion. So
No, I agree. I agree, but I just want to, because I've been part of this, I would hate to have not seen the conclusions.
Of course.
Anyway, bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you again. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. And Mariusz, I think Charles did the job for me. I was going to ask you about the sort of co-creation of the business narrative. You've heard Ewelina, you've heard Rasmus giving some examples of the shifts in the business models. I'm pretty sure that there are quite many municipal managers responsible for municipal interaction with the businesses, with the creative sector. What would be your recommendation about listening to the changes in the business models? What elements of these changes do you think that people in your position, for example, should be tuning in to listening to in terms of the impact of these new business models?
I think that if we want to be a real supportive local government, and if we want to take care of local business and local initiatives, we have to be quite smart, and we have to have a good plan and good organization of this process. First of all, we have to divide the huge whole business ecosystem of the city into 4, 5, 6 sub-ecosystems that it's easier to connect with the companies, it's easier to implement common projects. In Lublin, I will give you the example of our city. We are working in a couple of ecosystems that we decided to develop 9-10 years ago. This is IT and modern services sector, advanced manufacturing, biotechnology, medical sector, creative industry sector. And each sector has a special project manager responsible for the whole projects, relations, building links with the business and the universities. And it works. You have to work many years to build the trust, to build the common projects and the common vision of the future. And of course, the narration of what do we want to achieve and where we want to be in, let's say, in 2025 and 2030. And if we go to the pandemic shock that started in March and lasted, let's say, to the beginning of June, what we were doing with the business. I think this is also the example how we reacted to the business needs at that time. The business had to reorganize immediately. So they had to open new ways of selling goods, of distribute goods and services. And what we were doing as a city, we were heavily promoting these new ways of business, maybe not models, but business reactions and actions. So we were trying to identify 35, 40, maybe even more local initiatives, business initiatives that were aimed at surviving at the time. So we were trying to help these businesses to survive. And the question is, to me, the most important question is, what will be after pandemic? How many of these, let's say, initiatives will turn into the real businesses or new business models? And this is the questions that I don't have the answer now. Because, when we are talking about the startups, Ewelina told us about that there is an interest in tourism, medicine, and of course, high tech, etc. But I'm talking about the traditional businesses. And there are millions of traditional businesses in Poland and about 40,000 traditional businesses in Lublin. So they are the soil of the economy. And the question is, how can we help them to survive and maybe to also to inspire them or support them to reopen the old businesses or change some elements of previous businesses to a new shape. So this is the challenge. And to be honest, after 6 months, I don't see many examples that I can say that, okay, this business, after reshaping, remodeling, will, let's say, conquer the world or conquer the Poland. No, I think it's too early. So this is one point. We have to wait, but we have to take care of the traditional businesses. Not only creative, not only high-tech, not only future businesses. So this is one thing. The second thing, this is the creative and flexible bureaucracy. Creative in the Charles theory, flexible in the Alexander definition. I like both. But if you want to help the companies, you need to give them a hand during the crisis. And the crisis is the moment that the city, the business sectors can, on the one hand, they can grow up and go forward, but also this is a moment they can start to decline. In Lublin, I believe the moment of crisis was the moment of speeding up many initiatives. So from my perspective, I think the crisis will be a chance of the transformation of will be a factor of the transformation of the city. Because most of the companies reacted properly to the circumstances. 9 for 10 companies are doing okay now after 6 months. So this is, I think, very good result. Some of the companies increased dramatically the sales volume during the pandemic. So I'm not talking about only the medical companies supplying with the medical equipment and let's say spirits for the disinfection. I'm talking about all companies, they decided to make a step forward. So the crisis was refreshing for them. And the third element is that the take care from the city, the system of the take care that we planned many years ago and we are implementing now. And I'll give you one example. In March, in April, also in May, and when everything was closed, in the time of the total lockdown, I decided personally with my colleagues to telephone 60, 70 of Lublin companies. We called to the managers, to the top managers, to the owners, but also to our, let's say, co-workers. And we asked 2 questions. How can we help you during the pandemic? How can we help you? What can we do for you? And the second question is, what is your situation? What is your position? Yes. How are you dealing with the crisis? And in some cases, we could help promotionally or even by giving some other resources. But that, let's say, action, that telephones build another, let's say, dimension of the trust between the city and the business. And after 4 months, 5 months, I have a contact with these people. We are meeting, we are discussing, and you know what they are telling me? That the city, in the crucial moment, they telephone them. And that is enormously important for the companies, that somebody is taking care. Nobody from the government called them, nobody. nobody from the regional authorities, nobody from the, let's say, local institutions. Only city were taking care of the business at the time. And this is the factor that will give us another level of cooperation in the future, another dimension of the trust. Maybe that will enable new projects, a new competitiveness of these businesses.
Thank you. It speaks strongly. Ewelina, I wanted to comment.
Yeah. If I could join to this discussion, which Mariusz he started, as indeed this pandemic is a good soil, let's say, for startups, for innovative business ideas to be generated and after that to develop them. But the issue is indeed with companies which are operating in the region, in the city. What we have noticed in OIC Panel Foundation in this dramatic period, as Mariusz he mentioned, from the middle of March by the end of April, May even, because we are running also the loan fund. So we are providing the companies with the loans for the development. There wasn't any interest. It means that the companies, they were stuck with this situation and they didn't want even to think about the next investments. They didn't want to think about the next step, what will happen in 2-3 months. They were just waiting. Nowadays, when we are a bit more used to the situation, although in Poland, as you observe, the number of cases is growing up and the speed is really very dramatic. So we will know what will happen, but they are much more, the companies, they are much more used to the idea that they have to operate in this situation, and they have started also to think about investment. We are providing them nowadays with loans for the development up to 1 million of zloty, and there is a great interest. So it means that they have the potential for further development, even in this dramatic situation. Of course, there is a need to support them through different ways, and the government and the regional authorities, or as Mariusz was telling, they can also support them, but also a lot depends on the people who are inside the companies. If they will be able to change their approaches and their business models to adapt their companies and their businesses to the current situations.
That's a very good point, and I think that's also back to one of the points that Mariusz made, that was a very good point about us having potentially having a knee-jerk reaction when we speak about new business models. The reaction is to think about startups, but the new business models are vital for old companies, well-established companies, to redefine the way they operate, the way they work, and I think being in touch with other companies, but also with the local government can be helpful here. One of the effects, the results that we've seen for well-established companies throughout the pandemic was the necessity to switch to remote work. And Alexander has touched upon this issue earlier in our discussion, talking about people who can't afford to leaving the cities, and those who cannot afford to leave staying. And I'm wondering, what are the effects, the results of remote work gaining ground? First, Alexander, from your perspective, but then I would also ask others for your insights.
Okay, thank you. I will be very short because I think that we are coming to the end. So I will just I want to give you a few ideas, 2 or 3 ideas about what lessons could we get from the pandemic conditions for the future of our urban realities. I just want to make it like a game. If Mariusz would invite me as his advisor to help him to create the new strategy for 2030, I would tell him one paradoxical thing. I would say, forget about the city. Your mission is not making the city. For the next 10 years, your mission is making the city region. It's quite the opposite strategy. The new page of the urban history, which is very vividly opened during these last 6 months, is the private urbanism. That's the small urban, very compact settlements with no municipality, based upon self-government, using the business models, bringing people what they need, the proximity, the good idea of neighborhood, and being involved in all kinds of business and all this stuff like this, that will bring a lot of advanced and very good self-sufficient people living in these different settlements around the city. So if we previously speak about Lublin and the greater Lublin, I would say let's speak about the mega Lublin, which is rather big, imagined unit, making the micro-mobility of all these components very easy. And what is his personal mission as the city, let me say city head, as we use here in Russia, to be the godfather of infrastructure. Don't interfere into business and social and cultural life of people. They will organize it by themselves. But to be the godfather of infrastructure, make the mobility much more easier than it is now. I see that people living in such big megapolises like Moscow and very few other in Russian, people moved from the city. But where to move? Our older model was very simple: a flat in the middle of the city and dacha outside it. Dacha is not working. It is like like an exile. People want to live in settlements, in intended communities. Gated intended communities, small gated intended communities. Where to go? They went to small cities, but in all small cities they looked like aliens. It's very alien element. You can imagine. It's the same in Poland. When you move from Lublin to a very small city where 5,000 or 6,000 people live, they look at you. The Aboriginal people look at you like an alien element with something strange. So let restructure it. Let's use the mechanism of private urbanism to resettle and reconnect people, reconnect new businesses. Because it is not important not to motivate the new business startups, but how to involve them into the new sets, new, how it's in English word, set, I forget, nets, business nets, and to make it more effective, more conquerable, and so on and so forth. And exactly, more comfortable for people to live in. I think that in our case of pandemic shows that mortgage is usually not, in my country, is not given to any infrastructural project. It is a mistake. Give the mortgage for small airports, for small railway stations, for small transportation nets, for something like this. And they will they will start and they will be more effective than you will be for them. We have now 30% of people moved to remote work. I will give you one example from Moscow, and that will be the end of my talk. No pensioners older than 60 years ago are allowed to use the public transportation. You can imagine? That is the policy of city authorities to disconnect people. How you will restart this story? Let them establish the communities they like to live in. And that is the only one possibility, and that's the private urbanism. Mariusz, I tell you everything, you are in debt for me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Rasmus, is there a mega Copenhagen?
Yes.
There what?
Mega Copenhagen, since Alexander was suggesting, approaching it.
Mega Copenhagen. Well, it's funny because I think the world has become not flatter, but spikier. And when you look at where patents are made, when you look at where people are moving to, I think a very livable city like Copenhagen, there's not a lot of course, there are people commuting in and out. I think it's about 200,000 per day. At least it was. But you can actually I have 3 apple trees, a pear tree, and a plum tree in my garden, and I live 10 minutes from the city's central City Hall Square. So I think many cities, if they have done their homework well beforehand, then this wouldn't be so big a problem. Right now in Denmark, it's all the public sector employees that are staying home. They are working from home, and everyone else is optional. And I see that we have, I think at least in Denmark, it looks like we have made the city in a good way. Of course, the wealthier will always have more opportunities than the less wealthy. So, of course, those that can leave for a summer cabin, that they have to warm up a bit longer, or that can leave the city somehow, that is not that new. Have we made our cities livable? Then they will also be livable during a corona crisis.
That's a very good point. Being mindful of time, because unfortunately, even though I would like to keep us here for a few more hours, just allowing us to get some more coffee and nothing else, I need to stick to the timeline. So saying that we have around 3-4 more minutes left, I would ask a question that is a question from the audience, but I would sort of expand the question a little bit. And Mariusz, I think that would be mainly a question to you, but if others want to briefly jump in, you're more than welcome to. Let me read out the question and then add a couple of sentences to it. So the question is, how can we operationalize the detrimental and beneficial effects of climate change to improve policy with respect to adapting our cities to occurring changes as we've discussed? And my addition would be, having discussed all of that, climate change is a crisis, pandemic is a crisis. When you look at such crises, one that is very easy for everyone to experience, the other one that is less tangible, how do you leverage the crisis? What would be your main takeaway, main advice in terms of how do we leverage the pandemic and all of the changes that we've discussed in order to change the paradigm, in order to move forward to not the normal that we've seen before the pandemic, but the new constellation, the new arrangement of our economies and societies? Mariusz, the floor is yours.
I think that we've heard so many answers for that question. I mean, the micro answers during our discussion. But I will tell about one aspect of this structural change, structural crisis, which is politics. Maybe we forgot about the politics, but I can observe that in the cities, in the regions, there is a growing number of ideas, of social movements, and in one moment, in next year, 2 years, 5 years, they will explode. So in other words, my perception of that is that there is a room for alternative movements or unpolitical movements in the cities, in the regions, not related to the mainstream political parties. So in other words, from my perspective, there will be more independent mayors and politicians at the local level. And that will be a direct effect of the pandemic change. And you know where are the roots of this process? I think this is the the general process of participation that we observing in the cities for the couple of years. The first stage of participation was the co-creation of ideas, yes, for the city officials. Advisory. Then we moved to the voting, yes, for the, let's say, participatory budget, etc. And now these people, these movements, they want to rule. They want to co-manage the cities. And they are stronger and stronger because their political programs are the answers for the real problems in the cities, for the climate change, for the micro-mobility, etc. And maybe this is the final comment of that, but I will hear from Alexander, from Ewelina, from Rasmus, what they think, what is your perspective?
So I think we have like 2 more minutes. So yeah. I encourage you to share just a brief.
Then I will be brief. Creative bureaucracy is one thing, but I think we also need to innovate democracy. We need to innovate the citizen participation in the legislative process. We need to innovate how we choose people for office, and we need to innovate how the citizens are being informed about what goes on, that they get the right news, they get the right information. I think that is, we definitely need to innovate democracy as such, and not just bureaucracy.
Thank you, Rasmus.
Sorry. My conclusion, okay, very short, also 30 minutes. I would say that I'm less optimistic. I think that the main agenda for the future 2 or 3 years will be the just city. How to create more justful, more fair space inside the city, because the pandemic conditions, they gave ground for the emergence, for the genesis of new sorts of injustices, which we have no idea how to deal with. So we must be more attentive to what is happening in the remoteness, in the in education, in access of people to different resources of the city, and the last one, how to I would say it's again how to reconnect them again. Why I'm just making the access on this point, because I think Charles Landry was talking about that. We are all live on move. We are moving, even every day moving. And this is the greatest challenge for the traditional understanding of city citizenship, city involvement. If I have a flat in your city, but I don't live there, I am not the ordinary citizen. And how should I be re-involved into the city policy and into city local democracy, as Rasmus told? That will be the great challenge for our new development. Just city. Very simple.
Thank you. Thank you, Alexander. Ewelina?
Yes, thank you, Justyna, for this last word. I will come back to the issue of business and honesty. We didn't touch also education sector, which is really very touched by this pandemic. There is no sector which wasn't touched by the crisis, and any sector will not be the same after pandemic as it was before, let's say. It's a point for businesses also to have a look how they are operating, to change something, and to start, let's say, to start to create new paths for the operation. It's also a stop for the whole society to have a look how we are operating and how we are creating our environment. I think that this, what is happening now, it's also some, let's say, kind of advantage for the companies to change a bit the organizational culture, to the organizational climate, to work in different way, to appreciate employees also, and to give them what? Not creativity, but flexibility.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think it's a perfect last word. And thank you all for joining this discussion. It's been a pleasure, and I'm sure there are many answers that we haven't touched upon, many questions, sorry, that we haven't touched upon that need answers. But that's for us to continue the discussion through another channels. Now, thank you everyone listening in to this discussion for your participation. I hope it has been inspiring and informative. And thanks from my side, handing over to Lublin to Mr. Stanowski. Thank you.
Thank you, Justyna.
Thank you very much for this fascinating debate.
Thank you, Justyna, for brilliant moderation.
Definitely, it's also worth to organize additional panel on education. Definitely, in 10 years, the school would not looks like 100 years ago, the Prussian building where thousands of students are brought together. It will be totally different. Jeszcze raz dziękuję.
Thank you very much for this debate, and I would like to remind all of the participants of our Congress that there is ongoing voting for best practices in 5 categories: local government, education, culture, entrepreneurship. There are projects that may be voted for, best practices in towns and non-government organizations. And today, a regular meeting of a Grand Fair, and we will have meeting with the Lublin Ventures, and also accompanying events, Institute of Sciences of Political Studies, Eastern Center of Maria Curie Skłodowska University. 12:30 Polish-Ukrainian relations in the context of 21st century challenges, and an hour later Polish-Ukrainian trans or cross-border cooperation. It's going to be a workshop. Traditionally, we meet at our workshop 2:30, and it's about cooperating with migrations. At 4 p.m., the Forum of Partners, we are looking for partners in the field of culture, tourism and sport. And finally, 5 p.m., our local time, of course, meeting a local event dealing with Belarus, where the walls are going to fall. Belarus after the elections, in cooperation of New Eastern Europe Foundation and the Amicus Europa Foundation. 9:30 p.m., a cultural event accompanying our Congress. If you want to participate, you need to register to the eSteam platform. It's going to be a virtual exhibition in Labyrinth Gallery in Lublin. Thank you very much for the participation in the debate today, and please feel wholeheartedly welcome to our debate later on.